You can't have that here. The voice cut through the crisp autumn air like a dull saw. It was sharp, unpleasant, and utterly convinced of its own authority. I turned from the half-stacked cord of oak, wiping a bead of sweat from my brow. There she stood, a woman who seemed to be constructed entirely of sharp angles and disapproval. This was my first official introduction to Carol, the president of the Northwood Estates Homeowners Association. I'd only been in the house for a month. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet place to heal. After my wife, Martha, passed away, the old house felt cavernous, each room echoing with a silence that was louder than any noise. This new place was smaller, more manageable, with a good-sized workshop in the back and a fireplace that Martha and I had always dreamed of. Installing the high-efficiency wood stove insert had been the first real project I'd undertaken since she was gone. It felt good to build something again. The firewood was the final piece. A full cord of seasoned red oak, delivered that morning. It smelled of earth and thyme, a scent that promised warmth against the coming winter. Stacking it was a slow, methodical process, a kind of therapy. Each log fit against the next, a puzzle of wood and air. It was a tangible, honest task. Carol, however, did not see honest work. She saw a violation. "Excuse me?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She gestured toward the woodpile with a flick of her wrist, as if shooing away a fly. "That. The wood. It's an eyesore. It's against the covenants." I was a structural engineer by trade. I lived by codes, rules, and blueprints. Before buying the house, I had read the HOA covenants cover to cover. They were thick, dense, and full of mind-numbing legalese, but I'd read them. I knew for a fact there was no mention of firewood storage. "I've read the bylaws, ma'am," I said, trying for neighborly. "There's no specific rule about firewood." Her eyes narrowed. It was a subtle shift, but it changed her entire face from merely disapproving to actively hostile. Section 7, Article B, Subsection 4. All properties must be kept in a neat and orderly condition, free of debris. Your pile constitutes debris. I looked at the neatly stacked rows of wood. It was a work of art, a testament to patience. It was the opposite of debris. "This is fuel for my primary heating source, not debris. It'll be moved into the shed as soon as it's finished next week." The plans for the shed were approved by the HOA board, I might add. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed her face. She had clearly assumed I hadn't done my homework. "The approval for the shed doesn't grant you permission to create this mess in the meantime. It's bringing down the aesthetic value of the entire neighborhood." I wanted to ask her how, precisely, one measured the aesthetic value of a neighborhood and whether my woodpile had caused a statistically significant drop. But I held my tongue. I was new here. I wanted peace, not war. My life had been nothing but conflict for the last year, battling a disease that couldn't be beaten. I had no fight left in me. "It's temporary," I said, my voice firm but not aggressive. "It will be gone within the week." "It needs to be gone by tomorrow," she snapped. "Or you'll be fined." She didn't wait for a response. She spun on her heel, her sensible walking shoes crunching on the gravel of my driveway with angry finality, and marched back to her own immaculate fortress 2 houses down. I stood there for a long moment, the scent of oak now mingling with the faint, unpleasant odor of a conflict I never asked for. This was not the quiet I had been searching for. This was something else entirely. I picked up another log and placed it on the stack. The house of cards was already being built, and I was just one of the cards. The next morning, an envelope was taped to my front door. Inside was a crisp, professionally printed letter from the Northwood Estates HOA. It detailed my violation, unapproved outdoor storage of debris, firewood, and informed me of a $100 fine. It also stated that the fine would double every 24 hours the violation was not rectified. I sighed, the paper crinkling in my hand. This was absurd. It was a power play, plain and simple. I had dealt with difficult clients, stubborn contractors, and immovable city planning commissions. Carol was just another flavor of bully, one wrapped in the flimsy authority of a neighborhood committee. I decided to handle it the way I handled all professional disagreements, with calm, documented reason. I spent an hour that morning drafting an email. I sent it to the general HOA board address, making sure to be polite, professional, and thorough. I cited the lack of any specific bylaw regarding firewood. I reiterated that the wood was for my heating system and attached the HOA's own signed approval for my wood stove installation. I attached the approved plans for the woodshed, highlighting the completion date of the following Friday. I respectfully requested that the fine be rescinded. I felt a small sense of satisfaction after sending it. I had laid out the facts. I had been reasonable. Surely, the other board members would see the absurdity of Carol's position. I went back to my shed construction, confident that logic would prevail. I was wrong. Logic had left the building. The response came not from the board, but from Carol's personal email address, less than an hour later. It was a masterpiece of condescension and passive aggression. "Dear Mr. Henderson," it began, already setting a formal, chilly tone. "While we appreciate your proactive communication, the board has empowered me to interpret the bylaws as I see fit to maintain community standards. Your woodpile is a clear violation of the spirit, if not the precise letter, of the covenants. The fine stands. I suggest you find an alternative storage solution immediately." She had CC'd the entire neighborhood email list. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. A few sympathetic texts from neighbors I'd met, apologizing for Carol's behavior. "She's a nightmare," one wrote. "Just ignore her," but several others were from her sycophants, chiming in to support her. "Thank you for taking a stand, Carol. We have to protect our property values." She wasn't just fining me, she was publicly shaming me. She was painting me as the messy new guy who was dragging their pristine little utopia into the mud. The anger I had been suppressing began to simmer, a low heat in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't about a woodpile anymore. This was about control. I spent the rest of the week working on the shed, a quiet fury fueling my efforts. I worked from sunup to sundown, the rhythmic pounding of the hammer a substitute for the words I wanted to say. Each nail was a tiny piece of defiance. By Thursday afternoon, it was done. It was a fine shed, sturdy and well-built, exactly to the specifications the HOA had approved. With a sense of grim satisfaction, I spent the next 3 hours moving the entire cord of wood from the temporary stack into the new shed. When I was finished, my driveway was spotless. The debris was gone, neatly contained. I took a photo and emailed it to Carol and the board. "The violation has been rectified as per your request," I wrote, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I still had $300 in unjust fines, but I hoped this would be the end of it. The next day, another envelope appeared. My heart sank. Inside wasn't a bill, but a new violation notice. Violation, unapproved structure modification. My shed. The one they had approved. The letter claimed that the roofing shingles I had used were not of a pre-approved color variant, and that the shed was 2 inches over the maximum allowable height. It was a lie. I had used the exact material specified in the approved plans, and I had measured the height myself. It was perfect. The fine was $500. That was the moment something inside me shifted. The peace-seeking man who had moved here to quietly grieve was gone. He had been replaced by the engineer who saw a flawed system on the verge of catastrophic failure. Carol wasn't just a bully, she was a saboteur. She wasn't enforcing rules, she was inventing them to punish anyone who didn't bow down. The simmering anger turned into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just going to fight her. I was going to dismantle her. And I was going to use the same methodical, patient approach I used to design a bridge. I would find the stress points, identify the material weaknesses, and apply pressure until the entire corrupt structure she had built came crashing down around her. The first step in any project is research. You don't start pouring concrete until you understand the ground you're building on. My project was the systematic deconstruction of Carol's reign, and the ground was the HOA itself. I spent the entire weekend in my office, not building, but digging. I started with the official documents. I reread the covenants, not just for rules, but for process. I studied the articles of incorporation for the HOA, the meeting minutes that were publicly available on the community website, and the state laws governing homeowners associations. I highlighted every clause related to board authority, fines, and dispute resolution. It was dry, tedious work, but patterns began to emerge. Carol's name was everywhere. She had been president for 6 consecutive years, despite a bylaw that suggested term limits of 2 years. The minutes showed that the last 3 elections had been uncontested. The other 2 board members, a quiet man named George and a woman named Brenda, seemed to be little more than rubber stamps. Every motion Carol made was passed unanimously. Every appeal against her fines was denied without comment. This wasn't a board, it was a dictatorship in miniature. Next, I moved on to the financials. The quarterly budgets were vague, with large sums allocated to broad categories like landscaping and maintenance, and administrative services. There were no itemized breakdowns. The landscaping contract was particularly interesting. The vendor, Prestige Lawn Care, was paid a hefty sum each month. A quick search of state business records revealed the owner of Prestige Lawn Care, a man named David Miller. A little more digging on social media, and I found David Miller's profile. His sister was Carol. He was her brother-in-law. It was a classic case of nepotism, and likely a kickback scheme. It was unethical, but proving it was illegal would be difficult without access to their private books. Still, it was a weakness. A crack in the foundation. I needed more. I needed something undeniable. My focus shifted back to the source of the conflict, the woodpile. Her reaction had been disproportionate, almost frantic. Why was she so obsessed with my firewood? Was it just a random power trip, or was there something more? The public shaming, the immediate escalation, it felt personal. It felt like I had unknowingly stepped on a landmine. The thought gnawed at me. I started a new line of investigation. I searched local marketplace websites and community forums for firewood sales in our area. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There was a popular seller, operating under a generic profile named Hearthwarmth Firewood, who sold premium seasoned hardwood for cash. The photos showed neatly stacked cords of wood, often with a familiar-looking manicured lawn in the background. One photo, in particular, made my blood run cold. In the background, partially obscured but still recognizable, was the distinctive blue trim of Carol's house. Carol was selling firewood. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a slammed door. My legal, professionally sourced woodpile wasn't just an eyesore, it was competition. She wasn't the neighborhood protector, she was a black market firewood dealer, and I was a threat to her little side hustle. Her rage wasn't about aesthetics, it was about money. This changed everything. This wasn't just a petty tyrant abusing her power. This was a criminal enterprise, however small. And it gave me a new, much more powerful weapon. But I needed proof. An anonymous online ad wasn't enough. I needed to connect Carol directly to the theft, to the harassment, and to her illegal business. I needed to bait a trap. And I knew exactly what kind of bait to use. My engineering mind kicked into high gear. This was no longer just about winning a dispute, it was about designing a perfect, inescapable system of justice. The plan that began to form was complex, requiring patience, precision, and a deep understanding of my opponent's psychology. Carol was arrogant, greedy, and utterly convinced of her own untouchability. Those were not just character flaws, they were structural weaknesses I could exploit. The core of the plan was the woodpile. It was the object of her obsession, and it would be the instrument of her undoing. But I couldn't just wait for her to do something stupid. I had to create a scenario where her greed would compel her to act in a way that was not just wrong, but catastrophically self-destructive. My research had uncovered Carol's firewood business, but I needed to understand its source. Where was she getting all this premium hardwood? A few more hours of digging into local news archives and forestry department websites gave me a chilling possibility. Our state, like many others, was battling invasive species. The most notorious was the emerald ash borer, a tiny beetle that had decimated ash tree populations. To combat its spread, entire counties were under strict quarantine. It was illegal to transport any hardwood, especially ash, out of these zones. The fines were astronomical, and in some cases, it was a federal offense. One of the most heavily infested and strictly quarantined counties was just a 30-minute drive away. A dark, beautiful, and perfectly poetic idea began to take shape. What if some of my firewood came from that quarantine zone? And what if Carol, in her greed, were to steal it? This was the trap. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential consequences. but it had to be executed flawlessly. I couldn't actually break the law myself. I had to become an expert in quarantine regulations overnight. I spent the next 2 days on the phone with the State Department of Agriculture. I didn't tell them my plan, of course. I posed as a concerned citizen, a homeowner with a new wood stove, wanting to be absolutely sure I was complying with all regulations. I learned about the permits required for transport within a quarantine zone for disposal purposes. I learned about the approved disposal sites, which were equipped with industrial kills to kill the beetles. And I learned that possessing documented, infested wood for scientific or educational purposes was possible with the right permits. I found my loophole. I contacted the entomology department at the State University and explained that I was a hobbyist woodworker and amateur naturalist interested in studying the life cycle of the emerald ash borer for an educational display I was creating. It wasn't entirely a lie, I was certainly about to educate someone. They were surprisingly helpful. They pointed me to a licensed arborist within the quarantine zone who was legally permitted to handle and dispose of infested ash trees. I called the arborist. I explained my project and offered to pay him for a small, specific quantity of visibly infested logs. He was a gruff, no-nonsense guy who was more than happy to get paid for what he was otherwise legally required to haul to an incinerator. The key was the paper trail. I made sure every step was documented. I got a signed invoice from him specifying the wood was quarantined Fraxinus species, confirmed infested with Agrillus planipennis. I paid with a credit card, creating a digital record. I filled out a temporary transport permit to move the wood from his site directly to my property, listing my address as a temporary containment site for educational study. It felt like a spy movie. I was assembling the components of a bomb, all legally, all out in the open. The next step was surveillance. A simple doorbell camera wasn't going to cut it. I needed undeniable, high-definition proof. I bought 2 high-end trail cameras, the kind hunters use. They were motion-activated, had night vision, and recorded crystal-clear 4K video. I mounted one in the eaves of my new shed, perfectly aimed at the driveway where my old woodpile used to be. I concealed the other in a birdhouse on a tree across the yard, giving me a second angle. I tested them meticulously, ensuring the motion sensors were calibrated perfectly. Now, it was time to set the bait. I drove out to the quarantined county with my trailer. The arborist had the wood waiting for me. It was a pathetic sight, a dozen logs of beautiful ash, riddled with the distinctive D-shaped exit holes of the borers. It looked like any other firewood to the untrained eye, but I knew it was poison. I loaded it up, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. This was the point of no return. Back home, under the watchful eyes of my new cameras, I began to build a new woodpile. I took a few dozen logs of my clean, seasoned oak and stacked them in the exact same spot as before. It was a deliberate, open act of defiance. Then, I carefully mixed in the infested ash logs. I placed them strategically, not all on top, but woven into the pile, making it look like a single, cohesive stack of valuable hardwood. The trap was set. The cameras were rolling. The paperwork was filed away in a fireproof safe. All I had to do now was wait for the queen to make her move. I knew she was watching my house. I could feel her eyes on me every time I stepped outside. My blatant reconstruction of the woodpile would be an insult she couldn't ignore. It was a challenge, a red flag waved in front of an already enraged bull. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, I received an official, certified letter from the HOA's lawyer. It was a cease and desist order, threatening legal action if I didn't remove the hazardous debris from my property within 48 hours. The letter was full of blustering legal threats and accusations. It was designed to intimidate, to crush me under the weight of potential legal fees. But reading it, I just smiled. She was escalating exactly as I had predicted. Her frustration was making her reckless. To complete the illusion, I needed to give her an opportunity. I packed a suitcase, loaded it into my car in plain sight of her house, and made a show of telling my next-door neighbor, a kindly retired man named Art, that I was heading out of town for the weekend to visit my daughter. "Keep an eye on the place for me, will you?" I said, loud enough for anyone nearby to overhear. I drove down the street, turned the corner, and parked at a nearby park. I sat there for 2 hours, watching the live feed from my cameras on my phone. The sun set. The streetlights flickered on. my neighborhood grew quiet. Then, at 11:47 p.m., I saw movement. A dark pickup truck with a landscaping trailer attached pulled up silently, its headlights off, and parked in front of my house. The video was so clear I could read the Prestige Lawn Care logo on the door. Two figures got out. One was a large man I recognized from the social media photos as David Miller, Carol's brother-in-law. The other was Carol. My breath caught in my throat. It was happening. It was actually happening. I watched, my heart thudding against my ribs, as they crept onto my property. They didn't speak. They moved with a practiced efficiency that told me this probably wasn't the first time they'd done something like this. They started grabbing logs from the pile, my pile, and loading them into the trailer. They were selective. They took the best-looking pieces, the thick, straight logs of oak. And, just as I'd hoped, they took every single one of the infested ash logs. To them, it was all just valuable hardwood, free for the taking. They worked for nearly 20 minutes, stealing about a third of the pile, the most valuable third. When they were done, they got back in the truck and drove away as silently as they had arrived. I sat in my car in the dark park, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. I had it. I had everything. High-definition video of the HOA president and her crony trespassing and committing felony theft in the middle of the night. The Queen had taken the bait. And now, the checkmate was just a few moves away. My first move was not to call the police. That would come later. A simple theft charge was insufficient. This needed to be a public execution, not a backroom plea bargain. My stage was the next monthly HOA meeting, scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend meticulously preparing my presentation. I downloaded the video files from the trail cameras and edited them into a single, damning clip. I made high-quality prints of the invoice for the infested wood, the transport permit, and a fact sheet from the Department of Agriculture about the emerald ash borer, complete with terrifying pictures of the ecological devastation it caused. I compiled it all into neat folders, one for each member of the board and a few extras for interested homeowners. When Tuesday evening arrived, I felt a strange sense of calm. It was the same feeling I got just before a major structural inspection. I had done the work, I had checked the math, and I knew the structure was sound. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with folding chairs and bad fluorescent lighting. About 20 homeowners were there, a mix of Carol's supporters and others who just looked weary. Carol sat at the head table with her two board puppets, George and Brenda, looking smug and self-important. She ran through the agenda with brisk efficiency, landscaping updates, a reminder about trash can placement, the upcoming community picnic. Then she came to the final item. New business, she announced, her eyes finding mine in the small crowd. As some of you are aware, we have an ongoing issue with a homeowner in violation of community standards. Mr. Henderson, she said, her voice dripping with false concern, has repeatedly refused to comply with directives to remove a hazardous and unsightly pile of debris from his property. A murmur went through the room. Despite multiple warnings and a cease and desist letter from our council, she continued, the violation persists. Therefore, I am making a motion to levy the maximum possible fine of $5,000 against Mr. Henderson and to place a lien on his property until the matter is resolved. George seconded the motion immediately. Brenda just nodded along, looking at her hands. Is there any discussion? Carol asked, a shark smile on her face. It was a rhetorical question. She expected me to argue, to bluster, to make a scene. She expected to shut me down and humiliate me in front of my neighbors. I calmly raised my hand. I'd like to address the board. Very well, Mr. Henderson, she sighed, as if granting a great favor. You have 2 minutes. I didn't stand up. I remained seated, my folder in my lap. Thank you, Madam President. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. I believe the issue of the woodpile is, in fact, resolved. You see, a significant portion of it was stolen from my property last Friday night. Her smile faltered. A flicker of panic flashed in her eyes before she masked it with a scowl. What are you talking about? Don't try to change the subject. I'm not, I said calmly. I have the theft on video. I was hoping perhaps someone here might recognize the people involved. Before she could stop me, I pulled out a small, powerful projector from my bag and aimed it at the blank wall behind her. I clicked a button on my laptop, and the room was filled with the silent, crystal clear, night vision footage of her and her brother-in-law stealing my wood. The gasps were audible. People leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide with disbelief. The video played on a loop, Carol, the self-appointed guardian of community standards, sneaking around in the dark like a common thief. Her face went from pale to beet red in a matter of seconds. This is an outrage. That's doctored footage. It's slander, she sputtered, her voice rising in pitch. It's really not, I said, my voice cutting through her tirade. And the theft is actually the least of your problems. You see, Carol, you didn't just steal my firewood. You stole evidence. I started passing out the folders. Inside, you'll find a copy of an invoice and a transport permit for a dozen logs of ash wood that were mixed into that pile. Wood that I legally acquired from a licensed arborist in a quarantined county. I let that sink in for a moment. The room was dead silent, except for the rustling of paper. That wood, I continued, my voice low and steady, is infested with the emerald ash borer. By stealing it and moving it, you've committed a state and federal offense. Transporting quarantined biological material carries a fine of up to $250,000 and potential prison time. Carol looked like she had been punched in the gut. She was speechless, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. I imagine you were planning to sell that wood through your little, hearth-warmth firewood business, weren't you? I added, twisting the knife. You'd be spreading an invasive, ecosystem-destroying pest all over our county, and for what? A few $100 in untaxed cash. She finally found her voice. It came out as a shriek. Lies. This is a conspiracy. He's a lunatic. He's been harassing me. But no one was listening to her. They were all looking at the evidence in their hands, then at the video on the wall, then back at her crumbling facade. The spell was broken. They saw her now for what she was, not a leader, but a cheap crook. Her supporter, a woman in the front row, stammered, "Carol, is this true?" Carol just stared at her, her face a mask of pure, undiluted rage. She turned her fury back on me. You will regret this. I will sue you for everything you have. I will destroy you. It was the impotent threat of a cornered animal. It had no teeth. She had lost the crowd, her credibility, and her power, all in the space of 5 minutes. The meeting devolved into chaos. People were shouting questions. George and Brenda looked terrified, trying to distance themselves from her as quickly as possible. Amid the noise, I quietly packed up my projector and my laptop. My work here was done. The structure was collapsing, just as I had designed. But I wasn't finished yet. This was just the public humiliation. The real consequences were still to come. The fallout from the HOA meeting was swift and brutal. My video clip, anonymously leaked to a community social media page, went viral locally. The story was a perfect storm of petty tyranny and satisfying comeuppance. Carol became an overnight pariah in the neighborhood she had ruled with an iron fist. People she had bullied for years suddenly found their courage, sharing their own stories of her harassment and abuse of power. But Carol was not the type to go down without a fight. Cornered and exposed, she became more vicious, not less. She launched a scorched earth campaign against me. First came the false reports. An anonymous tip was called into animal control, claiming my small, quiet beagle was a vicious, neglected animal. An officer showed up, took one look at my happy, well-fed dog, and apologized for wasting my time. Then, a complaint was filed with the county zoning office, claiming my newly built shed was a commercial workshop operating in a residential zone. An inspector came, saw my woodworking tools, reviewed my purely hobbyist setup, and dismissed the complaint on the spot. Each of these was a minor annoyance, easily dealt with, but it was the next attack that truly crossed the line. She filed a formal complaint against me with the State Engineering Licensing Board. She fabricated a story, accusing me of professional misconduct on a past project, claiming I had cut corners and endangered public safety. This was a direct assault on my livelihood, my reputation, and the professional integrity I had spent 30 years building. The investigation, even if it ultimately cleared me, would be a black mark on my record. The stress was immense. For a few dark days, I wondered if I had made a mistake, if I should have just paid the initial fine and kept my head down. The peace I had sought seemed further away than ever. But then I remembered why I started this. It wasn't just about a woodpile. It was about standing up to a bully who preyed on people she perceived as weak. Giving up now would be a betrayal of that principle. Her desperation was just another data point, another sign that my plan was working. Her wild, frantic attacks were the death throes of her power. I knew I needed a final, undeniable piece of evidence to end this for good. The video proved the theft, and my paperwork proved the nature of the wood. But to make the federal charges stick, they needed the wood itself. They needed to find it on her property. That's when I got an unexpected email. The sender was anonymous. The message was short: Prestige Lawn Care. 1450 Industrial Way. Back lot. Blue tarp. Be careful. It had to be David Miller, her brother-in-law. He must have realized the depth of the legal jeopardy Carol had dragged him into. He was cutting his losses and giving up his sister to save himself. He was the whistleblower I didn't even know I needed. I didn't go to the address myself. That would be trespassing, stooping to her level. Instead, I forwarded the anonymous tip, along with all my other evidence, the video, the permits, the testimony from other neighbors, to a contact I had been given at the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. I also sent a copy to the state's Environmental Crimes Unit and the local police detective assigned to my original theft report. I laid out the entire narrative for them, clear and concise, like a project summary. I was no longer just a victim, I was a cooperating witness in a multi-agency investigation. 2 days later, the trap sprang shut. I was in my workshop when I heard the sirens. I walked to the front of my house and saw a parade of official vehicles, local police cars, county sheriff's vehicles, and 2 dark green SUVs with the seal of the United States Department of Agriculture on the side, rolling slowly down our quiet suburban street. They didn't stop at my house. They continued on and pulled up in front of Carol's. Neighbors came out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. We all stood on our lawns, watching in stunned silence as a team of officers and federal agents, some in tactical gear, swarmed her property with a search warrant. Carol came storming out of her front door, her face a thundercloud of fury. She started screaming at the lead agent, demanding to know what was going on, threatening to call her lawyer, the mayor, the governor. But her power was gone. She was just a frantic, shrieking woman on a lawn. The agent calmly handed her the warrant and his team got to work. They found everything. In her garage, they found stacks of cash and a ledger book detailing her off-the-books firewood sales. In the back lot of her brother-in-law's business, under a blue tarp just as the email had said, they found the stolen wood. My wood. The agents, wearing hazmat gloves, immediately identified the telltale D-shaped holes of the emerald ash borer. They bagged the logs as evidence. The final scene was more dramatic than anything I could have imagined. As the agents were leading a handcuffed, still screaming Carol to a squad car, her husband pulled into the driveway. He got out of his car, took one look at his wife in custody, the federal agents cataloging evidence, and the crowd of neighbors watching, and his face just crumpled. The public humiliation was absolute. As the car door was about to close, Carol locked eyes with me from across the street. Her face was contorted with a hatred so pure it was almost breathtaking. "This isn't over," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I'll get you for this, Henderson. You're a dead man." It was her last, impotent threat. The car door slammed shut, and she was driven away, leaving behind the wreckage of her little empire. The silence that fell over the street was profound. It was the silence of a fever breaking. After a moment, my neighbor Art walked over, a small smile on his face. "Well," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "I guess the neighborhood owes you a thank you." I just nodded, watching the last of the official cars disappear around the corner. It was finally over. The war was won. Now, maybe, I could finally find the peace I had been looking for. The aftermath was a study in contrasts. For Carol, it was a complete and total collapse. The legal charges piled up like cordwood. She faced felony theft from the local police, a raft of commercial and tax violations from the state, and the most serious charges from the federal government for violating the Plant Protection Act. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including the testimony of her own brother-in-law who took a plea deal, she was convicted on multiple counts. The judge made an example of her. He spoke at length about her abuse of a position of trust and her reckless disregard for the environmental damage she could have caused. She was sentenced to 18 months in a federal prison. The fines and financial penalties were staggering, easily wiping out their savings. Her husband, a man who had clearly been either oblivious or willfully ignorant for years, divorced her before the sentencing was even complete. He sold the house at a loss just to escape the notoriety and moved out of state. The last I heard, Carol was released early for good behavior and was living with a distant relative somewhere in the Midwest, stripped of her assets, her reputation, and her power. For the Northwood Estates community, the change was like spring arriving after a long, bitter winter. With Carol's reign of terror over, the atmosphere in the neighborhood transformed. The two remaining board members, George and Brenda, resigned in disgrace. A special election was held, and a new board was voted in, led by my neighbor Art. They went through the bylaws with a fine-toothed comb, eliminating the vague, subjective rules Carol had used as weapons and replacing them with clear, common-sense guidelines. The community began to heal. People started talking to each other again. There were block parties and barbecues. The oppressive cloud of fear and suspicion that Carol had cultivated for years finally dissipated. I became something of a reluctant local hero. People would wave as I walked my dog or stop me at the grocery store to thank me. I was never entirely comfortable with the attention, but I understood it. I hadn't just been fighting for my own property, I had been fighting for all of them. And for me. I finally found my peace. The complaint against my engineering license was dismissed, of course. The licensing board sent me a formal letter of apology after reviewing the evidence of Carol's malicious intent. My reputation remained intact. My little house no longer felt like a battlefield. It became what I had always wanted it to be, a sanctuary. A place of quiet and healing. I finished my workshop, and the scent of sawdust replaced the acrid smell of conflict. I spent my evenings woodworking, building furniture, creating things of beauty and function with my own two hands. On cold winter nights, I would light a fire in the wood stove. The flames would dance and crackle, fueled by the clean, seasoned oak stacked neatly in the shed that had started it all. The warmth would spread through the house, a comforting, tangible presence. It was the warmth Martha and I had dreamed of. Sometimes, sitting there in the quiet, I would reflect on the whole absurd affair. I had moved here seeking to avoid conflict, to build a quiet life on the foundation of my grief. Instead, I had been forced to go to war. But in fighting back, in refusing to be bullied, I had found something I didn't know I was looking for, a renewed sense of purpose. I had protected my home, honored the memory of what Martha and I had planned, and in doing so, had inadvertently liberated an entire community. Justice, I learned, isn't always delivered from on high. Sometimes, you have to build it yourself, piece by piece, with patience, precision, and a solid understanding of the structural weaknesses of tyranny. You have to be willing to find the cracks in the foundation and apply pressure until the whole rotten structure comes crashing down. I looked out the window at the quiet, peaceful street, the houses dark except for the warm glow of windows here and there. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the world in a clean, white blanket. My dog sighed contentedly at my feet. The fire crackled. The house was warm. This was peace. I had built it. And it was good.